He had always believed in his own abilities. People often told him he was talented, smart, and quick to learn, and he carried those compliments with a quiet pride. At work, he was known as someone who got things done efficiently. His ideas were listened to, his suggestions were considered, and his confidence grew with every nod of approval he received. He liked the feeling of being ahead, of being the one everyone looked to when they needed answers or results. He never doubted himself, and he rarely doubted anyone else because in his world, most people simply didn't measure up. It was a regular Thursday morning when she first walked into the office. She was quiet, unassuming, and there was a subtle nervousness in her eyes that made her seem ordinary at first glance. Her presence was gentle, almost shy, and she didn't demand attention. She carried her things carefully, kept her posture straight, and greeted the few people she passed with a soft smile. He barely noticed her at first. She seemed like someone new, someone who wouldn't stand out in the long run. In his mind, she was no rival, no competition, just another colleague he would barely remember. The office was bustling as usual, with people moving between desks, exchanging papers, and chatting softly about projects. He sat at his corner desk, surrounded by monitors, notes, and a small stack of awards from past achievements. He glanced at her once or twice, noting the way she hesitated by the coffee machine and then chose a seat at the far end of the room. He assumed she would take some time to settle in, perhaps even struggle to keep up. The thought of her becoming a real challenge never crossed his mind. She, however, seemed unaffected by the chaos around her. She unpacked her bag slowly, organized her materials with care, and started working in a quiet corner, focused and precise. He noticed this after a while, only because her presence slightly disrupted the usual rhythm of the office. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just noticeable in a subtle way. He watched her for a moment and shook his head, thinking she would soon fade into the background, like most people did. Days passed and she began to show herself more. She spoke softly in meetings, offered ideas that were clear, well thought out, and sometimes surprisingly innovative. But he dismissed them easily, nodding politely and then returning to his own tasks. In his mind, she was still learning, still inexperienced, and no threat to his reputation. He prided himself on recognizing talent quickly, and in his view, she simply didn't meet the standard. He would occasionally overhear others speaking positively about her. Colleagues mentioned her suggestions, her efficiency, and her attention to detail. They said she seemed to know exactly what to do without being told, and they admired her calm demeanor. Yet he paid little attention, believing that admiration would fade once she was tested more thoroughly. He still considered her a newcomer who would eventually face challenges she wasn't prepared for. One afternoon, there was a meeting that changed the routine of the office. The team was discussing a complex project, one that required careful planning, creativity, and precision. He presented his ideas confidently, explaining the steps, timelines, and potential risks. He expected nods of approval, and for a moment, everything went as planned. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, and she suggested a different approach, one that simplified the process without cutting corners. She didn't boast. She didn't insist. She simply explained her idea calmly and logically. He listened, slightly irritated at first. How could she, someone he considered untested and ordinary, propose something so efficient? But the more he listened, the more he realized her idea had merit. It was practical, well thought out, and clever in ways he hadn't considered. The room fell silent as others began to murmur in agreement, impressed by the simplicity and effectiveness of her suggestion. He felt a flicker of doubt, quickly dismissed, and continued to explain why his plan was better. Yet, inside, he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps she had seen something he hadn't. The next few days were filled with small but noticeable incidents that challenged his perception of her. She completed tasks faster than expected, handled unexpected problems calmly, and consistently showed a level of understanding and insight that seemed unusual for someone new. People started coming to her for advice, asking questions, and seeking her input. He noticed this with a mix of curiosity and irritation. She was gaining respect, quietly, without any need to assert herself. One morning, he found a note on his desk. It was simple, written in neat handwriting, with a few lines that directly addressed an issue he had been struggling to solve. The note suggested a solution that was both simple and effective, something he hadn't considered despite his experience. He picked it up slowly, reading it again and again, trying to understand how someone so new could see what he couldn't. His pride pricked him slightly, but it was mixed with an unexpected sense of admiration. He watched her that day more closely, noticing how she moved through her work with confidence, yet without arrogance. She was diligent, careful, and yet her actions suggested a natural talent, something innate that didn't require showiness or loud declarations. He realized that the note wasn't just a small gesture. It was a signal, a first glimpse of her potential. And with that realization came a hint of uncertainty, a feeling he hadn't encountered often in his career. Over the following week, he tried to ignore her, tried to focus solely on his own tasks, but it was impossible. Her work consistently impressed, her insights proved valuable, and her calm demeanor inspired others around her. Every time he thought he had her figured out, she surprised him again. The note had been only the beginning, the first hint that perhaps he had underestimated her entirely. He began to feel a quiet tension inside him. It wasn't anger or jealousy. It was something new, something he couldn't easily define. She wasn't competing with him in the traditional sense, yet she was forcing him to rethink his assumptions, to acknowledge that talent could appear in unexpected ways. He found himself watching, learning, and slowly realizing that the woman he had dismissed as no rival might be far more capable than he had ever imagined. By the end of the week, he sat at his desk, staring at the note once more. It was a simple piece of paper, yet it carried weight, carrying the silent message that first impressions could be misleading. He felt a mix of respect and challenge, a realization that he had underestimated her from the very beginning. And deep down, he knew that the story was only starting, that the note had changed something in him, something fundamental about the way he saw her, and perhaps about the way he saw himself. After the note, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time he sat at his desk, tried to focus on his work, or explained his ideas to others, her suggestion lingered in his mind. It wasn't just clever. It made sense in a way he hadn't considered. He felt a strange mix of pride and frustration. Pride because he recognized its value, frustration because he had overlooked it. He had always trusted his own judgment, but now, quietly, he began to question it. She, on the other hand, carried on as if nothing had changed. Her days were routine, focused on her work, but there was a quiet confidence growing in her. She was careful not to overstep or show off, yet every action seemed purposeful. She answered questions with patience, solved problems without fuss, and her presence became increasingly noticeable to everyone in the office. People started seeking her opinion, trusting her judgment, and she handled it all gracefully. He watched her from a distance, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously. He noticed the small things, how she organized her files, how she approached a new task methodically, how she explained her point without raising her voice. Each detail chipped away at his initial assumption that she was just another newcomer. He couldn't ignore her impact any longer. It was subtle but undeniable. One afternoon, there was a meeting about a new project that had been troubling the team for weeks. Everyone was brainstorming ideas, and he began outlining his plan as usual. He noticed her listening intently, pen in hand, writing something down quietly. Normally, he would have ignored her, assuming she had nothing new to offer. But he remembered the first note and felt a strange curiosity mixed with caution. He allowed her to speak. Her voice was soft but confident. She suggested a new approach, one that considered details no one else had thought about. It wasn't a radical change, but a refinement that made the plan stronger and more achievable. He watched the reactions around the room. Some people nodded, impressed by her clarity. Some whispered to each other, quietly acknowledging her insight. He felt a twinge of surprise. This was happening again. He had assumed her first suggestion was a lucky coincidence, but now he realized it was consistent, intentional, and thoughtful. He tried to dismiss it internally. Maybe the project was simple enough that anyone could have seen the solution. But as the discussion continued, it became clear that her approach was more than a simple fix. She had anticipated potential problems, considered different perspectives, and offered a solution that made everyone's work easier. Her understanding was precise, yet her manner remained humble. She wasn't seeking recognition, only to contribute and solve the problem. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about her more often than he liked. It was no longer just curiosity. There was a sense of challenge that he couldn't ignore. He had always valued being competent, being the one who could solve problems, and now he realized someone else was quietly matching his abilities, perhaps even surpassing them in subtle ways. The thought unsettled him, yet it was also strangely motivating. He began paying more attention to her work, noticing patterns, understanding her approach, and even questioning some of his own methods. She seemed unaware of the effect she was having on him. Her focus remained on her tasks, her interactions simple and polite. She didn't try to impress or compete. She just did her work well. Her calmness in the midst of office tension made her stand out, and others began to respect her in ways that went beyond skill. They appreciated her reliability, her insight, and the quiet way she earned trust. He couldn't help but notice the growing admiration from colleagues, and he felt an unfamiliar mix of pride and insecurity. One evening, he stayed late to finish a report, and she was still at her desk, working quietly. The office was nearly empty, the hum of computers the only sound. He watched her for a while, wondering how someone so young and seemingly inexperienced could carry such competence. She noticed him watching but didn't react. She simply continued typing, focused and precise. Something about her calm determination struck him. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was a quiet power that made him rethink his assumptions. Days turned into weeks, and the effect of the first note seemed to grow. Every suggestion she made, every small improvement she implemented, reminded him that he had misjudged her. He began to observe her methods carefully, learning from them without admitting it openly. He noticed how she broke down tasks into manageable steps, how she anticipated obstacles before they appeared, and how she communicated ideas in ways that were clear and persuasive. Slowly, he realized she wasn't just capable. She was exceptional in her own quiet way. The turning point came during a critical team discussion. A complex problem had arisen, one that had frustrated the entire group for days. He started presenting possible solutions, and then, almost instinctively, he paused and looked at her. She had already been analyzing the issue quietly, and when she spoke, everyone listened. She outlined a strategy that was simple, practical, and surprisingly innovative. The room fell silent as her plan unfolded. It solved the problem in a way that no one else had considered. He felt a mix of emotions: surprise, admiration, and a reluctant respect. He realized that she had grown more confident since that first note, but she hadn't changed her nature. She remained humble, unassuming, yet undeniably capable. Her ability to tackle challenges calmly and effectively made him reconsider his own approach. He had always believed he understood people's abilities quickly, yet here was someone who had quietly proven him wrong. From that day on, he began to treat her differently, not with condescension, but with cautious respect. He listened more when she spoke, considered her suggestions seriously, and sometimes even sought her input. The first note had been the spark, but her consistent performance and quiet intelligence had created a new dynamic between them. He felt a sense of competition, but not in the usual aggressive sense. It was a challenge that inspired him, a reminder that talent could appear in unexpected forms, and that first impressions were not always accurate. She, as always, remained unaware of the subtle shift. She continued her work diligently, focusing on tasks without concern for perception or recognition. Yet her influence in the office had grown. Others sought her advice, trusted her judgment, and respected her calm efficiency. She had become a quiet force, respected not because she demanded it, but because she earned it naturally. And he, who had once thought she was no rival, now understood that her presence had changed more than just projects. It had changed the way he saw competence, talent, and even himself. By the end of the second part of their story, he was no longer certain of his own superiority. The note had been the first indication, but her actions since then had made it undeniable. He realized that he had underestimated her from the very beginning. And though he would never admit it aloud, a sense of admiration and respect had taken root, quietly growing alongside a new understanding. That she was no ordinary colleague, no ordinary talent. She was someone who could challenge him, teach him, and in ways he had yet to discover, change the way he thought about himself and the world around them. He noticed it more and more, how her ideas worked, how her attention to detail prevented problems before they appeared, and how the team responded positively to her. It made him both uneasy and intrigued. He had always believed that experience, confidence, and speed were the things that made someone stand out. She had none of the flashy confidence he was used to seeing, yet she was achieving results that even he could not ignore. He found himself measuring his own work against hers without realizing it. Meetings became the most telling moments. They were normal meetings at first, with ideas thrown out, plans debated, and schedules discussed. He would start with his usual confidence, explaining his thoughts, predicting reactions, and expecting agreement. But then she would add her perspective quietly. She didn't try to dominate the conversation, didn't argue or push aggressively. She spoke logically, offering suggestions that made sense and solved problems he had overlooked. At first, he would internally scoff, thinking it was just luck or coincidence. But the repetition of her insight, over days and weeks, became undeniable. His colleagues noticed it too. People started quietly coming to her for advice, seeking her input on tasks, and listening more when she spoke. He watched as the dynamic shifted subtly in the room. He had always been one of the most respected voices, the person people turned to for answers. Now he was realizing that her presence had changed the balance. She wasn't replacing him, not directly, but she was a force he could not ignore. He tried to maintain his confidence, convincing himself that he could handle this challenge. Yet he found moments when he would pause before speaking, reconsidering the way he approached a problem because he knew she would notice every detail. There was a quiet tension between them that had nothing to do with hostility. It was a tension born of recognition, respect, and subtle rivalry. He was learning, slowly, that being correct wasn't enough. He needed to be thoughtful, thorough, and sometimes open to ideas he hadn't considered before. One day, a particularly complex project came up. Everyone was nervous because it had many moving parts, tight deadlines, and unclear expectations. He outlined his plan confidently, expecting approval and agreement. She listened attentively, taking notes, her expression calm. When he finished, she spoke, not to contradict him, but to suggest an adjustment that simplified the workflow and prevented potential errors. It was a minor change in wording, a slight modification in process, but it made a huge difference. He felt that familiar mix of surprise and admiration again. How had he underestimated her so thoroughly? It wasn't just about ideas. He noticed her calmness under pressure, her ability to stay collected when problems arose unexpectedly. There was no panic, no grandstanding, no showing off. She simply assessed the situation, considered the options, and made choices that worked. He found himself comparing his own reactions in similar circumstances, realizing that he sometimes let ego or impatience get in the way. She had a steadiness he lacked, a quiet confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. At times, he found himself working alongside her on tasks, whether intentionally or by chance. He was careful not to show how much he had begun to notice her approach. Yet there was an unspoken understanding growing between them, a subtle acknowledgement that each was capable, and that they were now measuring their efforts against each other without openly admitting it. Small glances, shared moments of problem-solving, and collaborative suggestions created a connection that neither needed to explain. It was a challenge, yes, but one that pushed both of them to perform better. He began to take notes of his own, analyzing the ways she handled projects and interactions. He realized that she had a method that combined patience, observation, and insight. He began to adopt some of her strategies, quietly improving his approach. This was not something he would tell anyone, of course. He still wanted to appear confident, capable, and experienced. Yet secretly, he was learning from her in ways that were both humbling and inspiring. One afternoon, A problem arose that could have caused the project to fail. Everyone was stressed, running from desk to desk, trying to fix mistakes and cover gaps. He felt his own frustration rise as he attempted to regain control. Then she calmly stepped forward, analyzing the situation and breaking it down into smaller, manageable parts. She delegated tasks efficiently, suggested adjustments that minimized errors, and reassured others without seeming to control them. Within an hour, the chaos began to settle. Her solution worked. Everyone looked at her, quietly impressed, and he felt a new layer of respect mixed with an odd sense of rivalry. She had won the moment not by asserting herself, but by staying composed and thoughtful. The effect on him was gradual but undeniable. He started questioning his assumptions, reflecting on how he had judged her from the start. He remembered the first note she had left, realizing that it had been the first indication of something he hadn't noticed before. Her natural talent, her insight, and her ability to influence outcomes without making a show of it. He had dismissed her too quickly, assuming that she was inexperienced or ordinary. Now he understood that she was neither. Yet he couldn't let go of his pride entirely. He still wanted to be recognized, to maintain his status, and to prove that he could handle challenges. He felt the tension of competing silently, aware that each task, each suggestion, and each decision was a subtle test of ability and judgment. It was a new kind of energy, a mixture of respect and competitiveness that kept him alert, focused, and sometimes slightly anxious. He realized that he had underestimated the value of humility and careful observation, qualities she displayed naturally. There were moments when he caught himself watching her, noticing small details. How she prioritized tasks, how she anticipated issues, how she communicated calmly with others. He realized that she was influencing not just the success of projects, but the environment of the office itself. People were more thoughtful, more attentive, and more collaborative around her. Her presence encouraged careful consideration, reflection, and cooperation. He felt a combination of admiration and challenge. He wanted to be as effective, respected, and influential, yet he had to acknowledge that she was teaching him subtly without words. He began to notice a change within himself. He was more patient, more reflective, and more willing to listen. He realized that he had been too quick to judge others and too confident in his own approach. She had forced him to reconsider the way he thought, worked, and interacted with the team. He understood that rivalry did not have to be loud or hostile. It could be quiet, motivating, and transformative. This realization was both humbling and empowering. At the same time, she continued without apparent concern for recognition or status. She worked diligently, focused on results, and quietly built respect among colleagues. She never flaunted her abilities or demanded attention. Her influence grew naturally, and he began to see that her success wasn't just about skills. It was about character, patience, and consistency. These were qualities he admired, though he would not admit it openly. By the end of this phase, he realized that the rivalry was more than just competition. It was a lesson, a challenge, and a mirror. She reflected qualities he had overlooked, and he could see areas in himself that needed growth. The dynamic between them had shifted, from simple underestimation to a mutual awareness of ability and potential. He respected her intelligence, insight, and calm determination, even as he wrestled with his own ego and desire for recognition. The story of their interactions had grown deeper, richer, and more complex. What had started with a simple note was now an ongoing challenge that tested patience, skill, and understanding. He knew, quietly, that this rivalry was not about winning or losing. It was about growth, reflection, and learning. And though neither of them spoke of it, each meeting, each project, and each moment together reinforced the undeniable truth. She was not just capable, she was extraordinary, and he could no longer ignore it. The day of the major presentation arrived, and the office was filled with quiet tension. Everyone had been preparing for weeks, checking details, rehearsing points, and anticipating questions. He had his plan laid out, confident that his experience and insight would guide the team to success. Yet he couldn't help but notice her calm demeanor. She moved through the preparation with quiet efficiency, her notes organized, her thoughts clear, and her focus steady. There was no rush, no panic, no unnecessary display, just a determined presence that spoke louder than words. During the initial part of the presentation, he outlined his proposals, covering every detail he thought necessary. As he spoke, he noticed her taking notes, sometimes glancing up, seemingly evaluating his points carefully. At first, he felt a prick of irritation. Why was she watching so closely? Was she looking for flaws, waiting for a chance to undermine him? But as the presentation moved forward, he began to see the pattern. She wasn't looking for mistakes. She was thinking, analyzing, and preparing to contribute in a meaningful way. When it came time for questions, a few were directed at her. She responded with confidence, answering clearly, providing examples, and simplifying points without appearing to compete with him. Then she offered a suggestion, not as a correction but as a refinement. Her idea was elegant, practical, and highly effective. It solved a problem he hadn't fully considered, and it did so in a way that improved the entire plan. There was a moment of silence as the team absorbed her input. He felt that familiar mix of surprise and admiration, but this time it was stronger. She had done more than contribute. She had transformed the project in a subtle but profound way. He realized that all the earlier moments, the small notes, quiet insights, and calm problem-solving, had been leading to this. She had consistently demonstrated skill and understanding, but now she had applied it in a high-pressure situation with undeniable results. He felt a quiet sense of challenge and respect. He had underestimated her, and now it was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just a capable colleague. She was a remarkable talent. As the presentation concluded, there were congratulations and murmurs of approval from the team. His own pride was tempered by a growing realization that she had earned much of the credit. She remained composed, accepting acknowledgement with humility, her focus still on the work rather than on recognition. He found himself studying her reactions, noticing the subtle confidence in her eyes, the way she handled attention without arrogance. He understood that this was not just about the success of a project. It was about character, skill, and presence. In the days that followed, the effects of her performance continued to ripple through the office. People sought her advice on important matters, trusted her judgment, and valued her input more than ever. He observed quietly, realizing that her influence had grown not through force or assertion but through consistent competence and calm reliability. He felt a mix of admiration and challenge. He had always valued being respected, being effective, and being a leader in his field. Now he had to recognize that her quiet approach had created the same, if not greater, impact. He found himself thinking differently about his work. He reflected on his assumptions, realizing that he had judged her too quickly. The first note, which had seemed like a small gesture, had been the first hint of her potential. Now, after weeks of observation and her impressive performance during the presentation, it was clear that he had been completely wrong to dismiss her. Her abilities were real, consistent, and transformative. He also began to notice subtle changes in his own approach. He became more patient, more attentive to details, and more willing to listen. He found that he was learning from her example, adopting strategies he had previously overlooked, and appreciating the value of calm, thoughtful action. She had challenged him, not with overt rivalry or confrontation, but through her work, her consistency, and her quiet confidence. The experience was humbling, yet it motivated him to improve, to reconsider his own assumptions, and to approach tasks with greater care and thoughtfulness. One afternoon, they were assigned a new project together. The office had grown accustomed to her contributions, and he could see the respect she commanded from colleagues. He approached the project with a renewed mindset, recognizing her strengths and anticipating the insights she might offer. They worked side by side, communicating with efficiency and clarity. He found himself listening more carefully, considering her suggestions seriously, and integrating them with his own ideas. The collaboration was seamless, a combination of experience and insight, of observation and action. During this project, a significant challenge arose unexpectedly. A critical piece of information was missing, and the team was unsure how to proceed. He instinctively prepared to lead the solution, but she quietly took the initiative. She assessed the situation, analyzed the options, and proposed a plan that was both practical and innovative. The solution worked perfectly, resolving the issue quickly and effectively. He watched her calmly navigate the challenge, realizing once more that her abilities were extraordinary. She had transformed a potential setback into an opportunity, without any need for recognition or praise. This experience deepened his respect for her. He began to understand that her strength lay not only in intelligence or skill but in character, focus, and integrity. She approached every task with the same calm determination, every challenge with thoughtful problem-solving, and every interaction with quiet confidence. He felt challenged, inspired, and, in a way, grateful. She had pushed him to grow, to reconsider his assumptions, and to appreciate the value of humility, observation, and consistency. As the weeks went on, he found himself acknowledging her contributions more openly, seeking her input, and even deferring to her judgment on certain matters. He recognized that she had earned the respect of everyone around her, not through assertiveness or self-promotion, but through action, insight, and composure. The first note, the quiet suggestions, and the calm problem-solving had all led to this point, where her abilities could no longer be ignored or underestimated. He also began to reflect on his own growth. He had learned that leadership and competence were not just about confidence and quick thinking. They were also about patience, careful observation, and thoughtful action. She had demonstrated these qualities naturally, and he had learned from her example, sometimes without even realizing it. The subtle rivalry that had begun as an underestimation had evolved into mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement of each other's abilities, and a shared commitment to excellence. By the end of this phase, he had changed in ways he could not have predicted. He was more attentive, more considerate, and more aware of the strengths of those around him. He recognized that underestimating someone based on appearances or assumptions was a mistake, and he valued the lessons she had taught him. Her performance had challenged him, inspired him, and ultimately helped him grow, not just as a professional but as a person. The turning point was clear. She had proven herself beyond doubt. The first note had been a spark, a hint of talent and insight, but her consistent actions, calm confidence, and effective problem-solving had created an undeniable impact. He had learned that true capability often comes quietly, without fanfare, and that underestimating someone can blind you to potential and growth. She had transformed not only the projects they worked on but also his understanding of talent, competence, and respect. The days after the major project were different. The office felt lighter, more focused, and even more collaborative than before. People moved with purpose, conversations were efficient, and a sense of quiet respect hung in the air. He noticed how her presence influenced the entire environment. She didn't command attention, didn't demand recognition, yet everyone seemed to value her opinions, trust her judgment, and learn from her example. He found himself observing this quietly, realizing how much had changed since that first note had appeared on his desk. He himself felt different. The first note had sparked curiosity, her early actions had challenged his assumptions, and the turning point during the big presentation had transformed his understanding of her abilities. Now, he approached tasks differently, more thoughtfully and deliberately. He listened carefully, weighed his decisions more carefully, and sometimes even paused to consider her perspective before acting. It was a subtle shift, one that changed the way he worked, interacted, and thought. At first, he had been reluctant to admit it even to himself. Pride and ego had made him dismissive of the quiet rivalry that had developed. He had believed he could measure talent quickly and had assumed she was no match. But now he knew otherwise. She was skilled, intelligent, and insightful in ways that complemented his own abilities. More importantly, she had taught him something he hadn't anticipated. That leadership and competence were not just about confidence and speed, but also about patience, clarity, and calm determination. The next project required teamwork, coordination, and trust. They were assigned to work together, and he felt a mix of anticipation and subtle tension. He wanted to perform well, to contribute effectively, but he also wanted to learn from her. She approached the project as she always did, quietly organizing her thoughts, understanding the requirements, and preparing to tackle challenges methodically. There was no display of superiority, no need for validation, just a steady focus on what needed to be done. As the project progressed, challenges emerged that required immediate problem solving. He noticed how she handled each obstacle with clarity and composure. She evaluated options, communicated solutions effectively, and reassured team members without demanding authority. He found himself relying on her insights, following her suggestions, and appreciating the way she led without forcing control. It was a new experience for him, one that combined admiration with humility. There were moments when he caught himself reflecting on the journey they had shared. The first note, the small suggestions, the quiet interventions, and the moments of calm problem-solving all led to this moment. He realized that he had misjudged her initially, underestimated her abilities, and overlooked her potential. And yet, in doing so, he had learned a valuable lesson. Talent often appears quietly, without fanfare, and first impressions can be misleading. The project reached its critical phase, and both of them worked late into the evening, coordinating with the team, finalizing details, and ensuring every element was perfect. There was a mutual understanding, a silent agreement that they were working toward the same goal. He respected her ability to remain calm under pressure, her focus on practical solutions, and her natural capacity to inspire others without seeking recognition. She respected his experience, attention to detail, and willingness to collaborate and learn. Together, their combined efforts produced results that were more effective than either could have achieved alone. During one of the final meetings, he realized something profound. The rivalry that had begun as underestimation had transformed into mutual respect, collaboration, and personal growth. He no longer saw her as a competitor or a challenge to be overcome. He saw her as a partner, someone whose strengths complemented his own. And he saw himself differently as well. He understood the value of humility, observation, patience, and thoughtful action. He realized that personal growth often comes from unexpected sources, and that respecting others' abilities was not a weakness but a strength. In the weeks that followed, the impact of their collaboration became evident. Projects were completed more efficiently, team members were more confident, and the office atmosphere was more positive and productive. He observed how she quietly influenced others, encouraging careful thinking, patience, and collaboration. He felt a sense of pride and admiration, not just for the results, but for the way she inspired those around her through her actions and character. He also reflected on the journey they had shared, from the first note to the critical moments of the presentation and the collaborative projects that followed. Each phase had taught him something new. He had learned that assumptions can be misleading, that talent and insight can be found in unexpected places, and that personal growth often comes from recognizing and valuing the strengths of others. She had been the catalyst for that growth, not through competition, but through her quiet excellence, consistency, and humility. He remembered the first note, still tucked in the back of his mind. At the time, it had seemed small and unremarkable, a simple gesture. But in hindsight, it had been a turning point, a signal of her potential, and the beginning of a journey that would change both of them. It had sparked curiosity, challenged assumptions, and ultimately led to mutual respect, collaboration, and growth. He realized that sometimes the smallest actions have the greatest impact, and that recognizing talent early, even quietly, can transform outcomes in ways one could never predict. By the end of the story, he had changed. He was more thoughtful, more observant, and more appreciative of the strengths of those around him. He understood that growth and success were not only about individual ability, but also about collaboration, humility, and learning from others. She had taught him these lessons without words, simply by being herself, performing her work with dedication, and demonstrating quiet excellence. The journey from underestimation to respect had reshaped the way he approached life and work. He no longer dismissed people based on first impressions, and he valued the insights, skills, and character of those around him. She had not only proven her abilities but had also inspired growth, reflection, and change. The first note had been the spark, but her consistent actions had created a lasting impact, showing that true talent often speaks softly, yet leaves an enduring impression. In the end, Their story was not about competition, rivalry, or who was better. It was about recognition, respect, and growth. He had thought she was no rival, and she had changed everything. Not by force, not by assertion, but by quiet, consistent excellence. She had shown him the power of humility, patience, and thoughtful action, and he had learned to value these qualities as much as skill and confidence. Together, they had achieved more than individual success. They had grown as professionals and as people, and the lessons of their journey would stay with them far beyond the projects and presentations that had brought them together.